Hi, welcome to Healing Tunes. Please watch the video. Today we are discussing the spinal cord, tracts, and spinal reflexes. Then blood supply and venous drainage of spinal cord. Tracts of the spinal cord. The tracts are defined as collections of nerve fibers within the CNS which have same origin, course and termination. The tracts are named after the name of masses of gray matter connected by them. The name usually consists of two components. The first component denotes the origin and second a termination of the tract. For example, a tract arising from cerebral cortex and terminating in the spinal cord is called corticospinal tract. Similarly, the tract arising in the spinal cord and terminating in the thalamus is called spinothalamic tract. See the picture. Arising from the cerebral cortex and terminate in the spinal cord, that is corticospinal tract. Origin from the tectum, then terminate in the spinal cord, that is tectospinal tract. Originate from the red nucleus and end terminate in the spinal cord, that is rubrospinal tract. Next part, ascending tracts that starts origin from the spinal cord and terminate in the thalamus, that is spinothalamic tract. Origin from the spinal cord and terminate in the tectum, that is spinotectal tract. Origin from the spinal cord and terminate in the cerebellar cortex, that is two regions, anterior spinal cord and posterior spinal cord. Anterior spinal cord is called anterior spinocerebellar tract. Posterior part is this posterior spinocerebellar tract. Then tracts are classified into three types: descending tracts, ascending tracts, and intersegmental tracts. The distribution of different ascending and descending tracts in three white columns: anterior white column, lateral white column, and posterior white column. In the anterior white column, descending tracts are included: anterior corticospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract, medial reticulospinal tract. Then ascending tracts, anterior spinothalamic tract. Next is the lateral white column. Its descending tracts include lateral corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, lateral reticospinal tract, then hypothalamo-spinal tract. Ascending tracts, lateral spinothalamic tract, anterior spinocerebellar tract, posterior spinocerebellar, then spinotectal tracts. In posterior white column, only ascending tracts is present, that is fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cutaneus. Then descending tracts. The descending tracts conduct the impulse from the brain to spinal cord. The descending tracts uh, are mainly lateral corticospinal tract, anterior corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, rectospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, and reticulospinal lateral and medial reticulospinal and hypothalamospinal tract. See the picture. uh, Hypothalamic tracts point, then lateral corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, then lateral reticulospinal tract, medial reticulospinal and olivospinal tract, and vestibulospinal tracts. Next is the corticospinal tract or pyramidal tract is the two regions, lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal tract. Lateral corticospinal tract located in the lateral white column of spinal cord. Its origin from primary motor cortex area 4, premotor cortex area 6 of the opposite cerebral hemisphere, that is upper motor neuron. It terminates the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord, that is lower motor neuron. Its function is controls conscious skilled movements, especially of hands, that is contraction of individual or small group of muscles, particularly those which move hands, fingers, feet, and toes. Next is the anterior corticospinal tract, that is uncrossed pyramidal tract, that's located in the anterior white column. Or its origin from the primary motor cortex area 4, premotor cortex area 6 of the opposite cerebral hemisphere, that is upper motor neurons, and terminated in the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord, that is lower motor neuron. Its function is same as the lateral corticospinal tract, that is the conscious skilled movements, especially hands, fingers, and feet and toes movements. This is the corticospinal tract and pyramid. Though pyramidal tracts. The pyramidal tract consists of about 1 million fibers. These arise from motor area of the cerebral cortex, hence termed as upper motor neuron. The pyramidal tract is so named because corticospinal tract transfers the medullary pyramids, but it also includes corticobulbar or corticonuclear fibers which descend to the brainstem, crossing to the opposite side and terminate by synapses with nerve cells of the brainstem nuclei of the cranial nerves. Its origin from the most of the fibers corticospinal tract arise from pyramidal cells of the motor area of the cerebral cortex. Some fibers arise from other part of the cortex. Its course is the fiber passes through corona radiata, internal capsule, crus cerebri of the cerebral peduncles, ventral part of the pons, and pyramids of the medulla oblongata. In the lower part of the medulla, majority of fibers cross to the opposite side at the pyramidal dissection of the medulla and descend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord as laterocorticospinal tracts. About 20% fibers do not cross. The uncrossed fibers descend in the anterior white column of the spinal cord as anterior corticospinal tracts. Lateral corticospinal tract also contain some fibers which arise from the ipsilateral cerebral cortex. The lateral corticospinal tract lies in the lateral white column in front of the posterior horn and medial to the posterior spinocerebellar tract. The anterior corticospinal tract lie in the anterior white column close to the anterior median fissure. Lower down the fibers of anterior corticospinal tract also close to the opposite side in the anterior white commissure of the spinal cord at the level of the termination. These tracts terminated by synapses with the anterior horn cells. Next is the rubrospinal tracts. It's located in the lateral white column. It originates from red nucleus of the opposite side located in midbrain, terminated in the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Its action is unconscious coordination of movements, that is controls muscle tone and synergy. Next tract is the tectospinal tract. Its location is the anterior white column. It originates from superior colliculus of the opposite side, terminate in the cranial nerve nuclei in medulla and anterior horn cell of the upper spinal segments. Function is controls movement of head, neck, and arm in response to visual stimuli. Next is the vestibulospinal tract. It's located in the anterior white column. It's originates from vestibular nucleus, then terminated to anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Function is unconscious maintenance of posture and balance. Next is the lateral reticulospinal tract. It's located in the lateral white column, origin from reticular formation in midbrain, pons, and medulla, terminated, terminated to anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Function is mainly responsible for facilitatory influence on the motor neuron to the skeletal muscles. Next tract is the reticulospinal, that is medial reticulospinal tract. It's located in the anterior white column, origin from the reticular formation in medulla, terminate into anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Its function is mainly responsible for inhibitory influence on the motor neuron to the skeletal muscles. Next, one more important tract is the hypothalamospinal tract. It projects from the hypothalamus, descend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord on the medial side of lateral corticospinal tract and terminates by synapses with lateral horn cell of T1 to L5 spinal segments responsible for sympathetic outflow and lateral horn cell of S2, S3 and S4 spinal segments responsible for parasympathetic outflow. Next is the ascending tracts. The ascending tracts conduct the impulse from the periphery to the brain through the cord. The important ascending tracts fall into the following three types. First one is the those concerned with pain and temperature sensations and crude touch. Example, lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts. Second one is the those concerned with fine touch and conscious proprioceptive sensation. Example, fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cutaneus. Third one is those concerned with conscious proprioception and muscular coordination. Example, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. Ascending tracts are mainly spinothalamic tract, that is a lateral spinothalamic tract, anterior spinothalamic tract. Then spinocerebellar tracts, posterior spinocerebellar tract and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. Then fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cutaneous. Cuneatus. See the picture, fasciculus cutaneous and dorsal lateral tract, posterior spinocerebellar tract, anterior spinocerebellar tract, lateral spinothalamic tract, spinal tract, and anterior spinothalamic tract, anterior corticospinal tract. First one is the lateral spinothalamic tract. It's located in the lateral white column. It's originate from posterior horn cells of spinal cord of opposite side and terminated to ventral posterolateral nucleus of thalamus. Its function is carries pain and temperature from opposite side of the body. Next is the anterior spinothalamic tract. It's located in the anterior white column, originates from posterior horn cell of the spinal cord of opposite side and terminated to ventral posterolateral nucleus of thalamus. Its function is carries light touch, pressure, tickle and itch sensation from opposite side of the body. See the anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract. Lateral spinothalamic tract, the cell bodies of first order sensory neuron, that is pseudo unipolar neuron, of this tract lie in the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal nerves. The central process of these cells enter the cord through the lateral division of dorsal root of the spinal nerves. In cord, the fibers ascend one or two segments in the dorsolateral tract leisure at the tip of posterior horn and then relay in the posterior horn by synapses with the cells of substantia gelatinosa. The axon of second order sensory neurons of substantia gelatinosa cross to the opposite side in the anterior white commissure and ascend up as lateral spinothalamic tract in the opposite lateral white column just lateral to the anterior horn. Next tract is the anterior spinothalamic tract. The anterior or ventral spinothalamic tract carries light touch, pressure, tickle, and itch sensation from the opposite half of the body. The cell body of the first order sensory neuron of this tract lie in the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal nerves. The central process of these cells, that is, large and heavily myelinated fibers of spinal nerves and ascend in the cord one or two segments in dorsolateral tract of leisure and relay in the substantia gelatinosa of the posterior horn. The axons of secondary sensory neurons of substantia gelatinosa cross the midline in the anterior white commissure and then ascend as ventral spinothalamic tract in the opposite anterior white column just in front of the anterior horn. Next is the posterior spinocerebellar tract. This originate located in the lateral white column superficially, then originate in the posterior horn cell of the spinal cord of same side, then terminated in the cerebellum. Function unconscious kinesthesia, that is proprioception. Next is the anterior spinocerebellar tract. That's also located in the lateral white column, then originate from the posterior horn cell of the spinal cord of same side and terminated in the cerebellum. Function is unconscious kinesthesia. See the spinocerebellar tract. The spinocerebellar fibers are located in the lateral white column of the cord and are divided into two tracts according to their location in the cord: posterior spinocerebellar tract and anterior spinocerebellar tract. This carries unconscious proprioceptive sensations from cord to the cerebellum and play an important role in the muscular coordination. Posterior or dorsal spinocerebellar tract, the cell bodies of the first order sensory neuron lie in the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal nerves. The central process of this cell enter the posterior horn of gray matter through posterior root of spinal nerves and relay in the nucleus dorsalis. The axons of cells of nucleus dorsalis pass to the dorsolateral part of the white column on the same side and ascend as posterior spinocerebellar tract. The fibers of the tract enter the cerebellum through inferior cerebellar peduncle and terminate in the ipsilateral cerebellar cortex. Next is the anterior or ventral spinocerebellar tract. The origin and course of this first order sensory neuron are same as that posterior spinocerebellar tract. The axon of cells of the nucleus dorsalis cross to the opposite side and pass to the anterolateral part of the lateral white column of the spinal cord and then ascend to form the anterior spinocerebellar tract. The fibers of the anterior spinocerebellar tract enter the cerebellum through superior cerebellar peduncle and terminate in the ipsilateral cerebellar cortex. The input of both posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts is ipsilateral. Functionally, both posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts carry impulses from the lower limb. The posterior tract is concerned with the five movements, whereas anterior tract is concerned with gross movement of the lower limb as a whole. Next is the fasciculus gracilis. This located in the posterior white column of spinal cord. It's originate from the dorsal root ganglia of spinal nerve of the same side, then terminated to nucleus gracilis and nucleus cutaneous in the medulla of the same side. Its function is joint sense, vibration sense, two-point discrimination, stereognosis, conscious kinesthesia. Then fasciculus cutaneous also located in the posterior white column of the spinal cord, origin from the dorsal root ganglia of spinal nerves of the same side, then terminated in the cutaneous medulla of the same side. Function same as the fasciculus gracilis, that is joint sense, vibration sense, two-point discrimination, stereognosis, and conscious kinesthesia. Next classification is the intersegmental tracts. The short ascending and descending tracts which originate and end within the spinal cord exist in the anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns. The functions of these tracts is to in connection the neurons of different segmental levels. These tracts are particularly important in intersegmental spinal reflexes. Next is the spinal reflexes. The reflex is defined as an automatic response to a stimulus that occurs without conscious thought. The spinal reflexes are classified into two types: deep spinal reflex and superficial spinal reflex. First is the deep spinal reflex. These are elicited by stroking a tendon, hence called tendon reflexes. Example: knee jerk, ankle jerk, etc. Then classic example of spinal super spinal deep reflex is the knee jerk or tendon reflexes. It is classical example for stretch reflex and used by clinician to determine if higher centers that normally influence the reflex are functional. When ligamentum patellae is tapped with a reflex hammer, the quadriceps muscle is stretched. As a result, the influential fibers within the muscle spindle are also stretched. Consequently, sensory fibers innervating the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle are stimulated and send afferent action potential to the spinal cord segments, that is L2, L3, and L4, where they stimulate alpha motor neurons directly. The efferent fibers arising from these neurons transmit action potential to the extrafusal fibers of the quadriceps muscle, causing a rapid contraction of stretched muscle leading to extension of knee. The stretch reflex is unique in that it does not require an association neuron between the afferent and efferent neurons, that is, monosynaptic neuron. See the touch receptors, then sensory neuron and dorsal root ganglia, and got the then return to the motor neuron. Next is the superficial spinal reflexes. These are elicited by stimulating skin or mucous membrane. These are usually withdrawal reflexes. For example, plantar reflex, climatic reflexes, abdominal reflexes, anal reflexes, etc. First is the plantar reflex, that is that's spinal segments is L5S1. This stroking the spinal of sole along anterior and lateral border. That response is plantar flexion and adduction of toes. Second is the cremastic reflex. That segment is L1 and L2. Gentle stroking of the skin on upper medial aspect of thigh. Its response is ipsilateral testis is pulled up due to contraction of cremator muscle. Next reflex is the abdominal reflex. Abdominal reflex upper part is T7 to T8 and middle T9 and T10, lower T11 and T12. Upper reflex by stroking the skin from the side to side in upper region of the abdomen, middle region of the abdomen, lower region of the abdomen. Its response is contraction of underlying muscles, sometimes pulling up umbilicus towards stimulus. Next reflex is the anal reflex or perineal reflex. That's spinal segments is S2, S3 and S4. By stroking perineal skin, that response is contraction of external anal sphincter. Then superficial spinal reflexes include stretch reflex. The stretch reflex or myotatic reflex refers to the contraction of a muscle in response to its passive stretching. When a muscle is stretched, the stretch reflex regulates the length of the muscle automatically by increasing its contractility as long as the stretch is within the psychological limits. This classic example is the knee jerk. Next is the Golgi tendon reflex. Golgi tendon reflex, also called inverse stretch reflex or autogenic inhibition or tendon reflex, is an inhibitory effect on the muscle resulting from the muscle tension stimulating Golgi tendon organs of the muscles, and hence it is self induced. Next is the withdrawal reflex, also called flexor withdrawal reflex. This reflex is very important as it is directed towards the preservation of animal. For example, if the sole of the foot of a sleeping person is pricked with the sharp pin, the leg is reflexly down up. The neural mechanism of this response is as follows. The action potential, that is, nerve impulses produced by pain stimulus travel through the afferent neurons of the dorsal root of the spinal nerve to the spinal cord, whereas these synapse with the alpha motor neurons. The alpha motor neurons stimulate flexor muscles which remove the limb from the source of painful stimulus. It involves only one synapse, hence called monosynaptic reflex. The reflex arc involved in this reflex consists of five basic components and involved more than one synapse, hence it is called polysynaptic reflex arc. Reflex arc, it is a nerve pathway involved in a reflex action. It's two types, monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Monosynaptic reflex arc, it consists of only two neurons, one sensory neuron and one motor neuron, and one synapse. Its feature is on one synapse is present between afferent and efferent neurons. Example: stretch reflex, biceps and triceps, and knee jerk. Then next is the polysynaptic reflex arc. It consists of sensory neuron, motor motor neuron, and multiple interneurons, relay neurons. It has multiple synapses. Its feature is more than one synapse, that is, one or more interneurons are present between afferent and efferent neurons. Example: withdrawal reflexes, gauche flexor reflex, gauche extensor reflex. Next is the blood supply of spinal cord. The spinal cord is supplied by the following arteries: anterior spinal artery, two posterior spinal arteries, and segmental arteries. The anterior spinal artery is formed by the union of two small spinal branches of the right and left ventral arteries in the upper cervical canal. It runs caudally in the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord and terminates along the filum terminale. There are two posterior spinal arteries, each arising as a small branch from either the vertebral or posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Each posterior spinal artery runs down on the posterolateral aspect of the spinal cord in the posterolateral sulcus along the line of attachment of posterior nerve root, and usually divides into two collateral arteries along the medial and lateral sides of the posterior nerve roots. Thus, there are five longitudinal arteries along the spinal cord. These arteries are reinforced by the segmental arteries to form five longitudinal arterial trunks. These arterial trunks communicate around the cord, forming a pile plexus, the arterial vasocorona. The anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior two-thirds of the cord, whereas two posterior spinal arteries together supply the posterior one-third of cord. The segmental arteries are spinal branches of deep cervical, ascending cervical, posterior intercostal, lumbar, and lateral sacral arteries. These reach the spinal cord as anterior and posterior radicular arteries along the corresponding roots of the spinal nerves. respectively, and nourish the nerve root. There are about 8 anterior and 12 posterior radicular arteries which reach the spinal cord. After reaching the spinal cord, these reinforce the anterior and posterior spinal arteries to form 5 longitudinal arterial trunks. The radicular arteries are regular serial enforcements to the spinal arteries. The anterior radicular arteries are large but less in number than posterior radicular arteries. Frequently, the anterior artery at the 11th thoracic segmental level is very large and termed arteria radicularis magna. Then, venous drainage of spinal cord. The vein draining in the spinal cord form six longitudinal venous channels around the cord. Two median longitudinal, one in the anterior median fissure and the other in the posterior median fish sulcus. Second is two anterolateral, one on either side posterior to the anterior nerve root. Then two posterolateral, one on either side posterior to the posterior nerve root. These longitudinal venous channels communicate with the internal vertebral venous plexus and drained by veins which leave through the intervertebral foramina to empty into the vertebral posterior intercostal lumbar and lateral sacral veins. The internal vertebral venous plexus communicates above with the basilar venous plexus. That's all about the spinal cord. We completed the spinal cord sessions, two parts, part 1 and part 2. Okay, next sessions we will discuss cerebrum. Please subscribe the channel, like the video and share it. Thank you for watching our channel.